So US GDP by year compared to recessions and events. So this is an old, well not old, but this is a site I bookmarked a long time ago. And it has some interesting statistics I want to just talk about. So it starts from 1929 and goes to 2019. They updated recently. So let's read what it is about. So if you're new to economics, then here's here's a basic outline of it. So we'll be comparing it with real GDP actually. So they only measure in nominal GDP and real GDP, which in this case is just one that takes into account inflation. So you can compare the GDP of different years. There's no GDP PPP, which is short for purchasing power parity. But generally, for pretty much all countries, GDP PPP data only started from 1980. I think that's when they came up with that measure. Nominal GDP has been there since 1929 for the US. Most economies started recording their GDP nominal from 1960 and onwards, mainly because the world wars and all that, and that just makes counting GDP really hard. So that wasn't their main priority. When we entered peacetime, that's when they started recording GDP data. So let's look at what their real GDP is. So that accounts for inflation, and because of that, it makes comparisons to previous years more accurate. The BEA uses it to calculate GDP growth rate and GDP per capita. Real GDP is important because without cancelling out the effects of inflation, the GDP could appear to go when really all that's happened is an increase in prices. That's true. So that's how they do the calculations. So the base year is 2012. Keep that in mind. So here's a table. So we'll be looking at real GDP instead of nominal. That's all. It's just more accurate. So it says it's not applicable here, right? So how do you look at this chart? So what's happening here is this negative 8.5% is actually supposed to be here, because the negative 8, that contraction is actually from the base GDP of 1.1. trillion down to just 1 trillion, running it off, that is. So the Great Depression began. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's irrelevant to this. Great Depression began, so this is basically what we're seeing nowadays in the US is basically a repeat of what happened back then, before the New Deal, that is. And we're basically seeing the same things, except for the huge contractions in growth, GDP growth, that is. For now, the US is just struggling along, really. Snail's pace growth, 2%, 4%, if they get lucky. But yeah, they're really struggling this time. And the reasons are similar. Just neoliberalism funneling all the wealth to the top 1%, to the rich, how you want to call it, and leaving very little for the people. But that's not all. So I'll get to that just in a bit. But we'll just look at the table for now. And so basically that 8.5%, see here, that should be there. That's the contraction, or it should be in the middle here, but you can't make that in a table. It should be in the middle here, so like negative 8.5%, leading to a drop in GDP 1 trillion. I don't know, I think that's irrelevant. That's also an environmental issue, by and large pretty irrelevant. So 1930, negative 6.4% growth, so contraction in GDP. 1931, 13% contraction in GDP growth. Tax hikes, sure, that happened, but it's not like that would depends on where that revenue goes. If it goes to infrastructure, something productive, then that helps ease the situation a bit. But when you're during the Great Depression, there's a lot of consumer suffering, if you want to call it that. The consumers, like, they just didn't have the money, and consumer spending went way down. So I haven't read much about the tax hikes here, but I'm assuming it could have been for the middle class, poor, because FDR got elected instead, and then he came out. So the previous year, so in 1932, we see a negative 1.2% contraction. When the New Deal comes out, as soon as it comes out, we see a growth of 11%, almost 11%, highly impressive. And they say US debt rose. Yeah, it did on the balance sheets. That would appear to be the case. So the New Deal is actually investment credit creation. Now I've covered this on my Reddit post. So my subscribers, so the viewers from that Reddit post, they would know what investment credit creation is. So as soon as the New Deal was implemented, and investment credit creation being a part of it, 10.8% growth, phenomenal, starting off. 1934, 8.9% growth. let's put it at 9% growth. So they label this as events affecting GDP. So 1935, 13% growth, incredible. And I think Social Security, that's all that's required to produce that amount of growth. Well, there are a lot of countries with Social Security, but we don't see that kind of growth there. So moving down, 1936, growth goes down quite a bit, 5%. So I think tax hikes again are the reason. So presumably they think GDP growth went down because of tax hikes. However, FDR's tax hikes target are basically based on income. I'm pretty sure they're based on income, yeah. So the wealthier, rather, it's actually based on your wealth. So the wealthier you are, the higher the taxes. So around, for the richest people, it was around 80%, I'm pretty sure, or higher. And it goes lower, the lower in wealth you're at, wealth level you're at. Now, 1937, we see a contraction. So negative minus 3.3%, depression returned. So presumably they think it's because of FDR's tax hikes that you see the contraction in GDP. But there's no evidence for that. We need to do more investigation into it. And 1938, 8% growth. So the depression ended. Depression returned. They might as well not have included anything. Events affecting GDP. Okay, so that's an 8% growth in 1938. So here, 1939, 8.8%. I think it's because of World War II. Dust Bowl did, so they think that had some kind of an effect on GDP. It could, but it's incredibly marginal. Environmental factors. Generally, it had to be something on a scale of like an ice age to have a really big impact on GDP. Even then, we don't really know. So 1940, so 1940 to 42 are the years. We see some massive growth. So 1940, 17.7%. This is the highest. So 19% is actually the highest of any major economy we've seen so far. That's pretty incredible. So base of 1.33 trillion to 1.566 trillion, and they think it's because defense increased. Well, how does what cause? It's not the free market that decides. I think that's what they're assuming here. Like, they don't give an explanation, deeper explanation, and defense increased, but it's much more than that. You can't have defense increase without funding, and that funding is investment creation. And the U.S. Switched its into a wartime economy basically, and all its factories started producing wartime equipment. We have to of course take into account revenues they get from exports. So when the European powers So when the European powers were importing US made equipment, uh, war equipment, that's a lot of revenue for the US, and that helped a lot as well. But generally, investment credit creation, since it when it's um, directed towards building up manufacturing, we have a massive surge in the amount of goods being produced that fills in the consumer demand within the country, and the rest can be exported. There's such a massive amount being produced that it can't be consumed within the country. It gets exported. So we have 17.7% in 1940, 19% in 1941, 17% in 1942, and 8% in 1943. So defense spending tripled. Once again, no explanation as to why, how that happened. How can defense spending increase by that much, tripled? You don't have it coming out of nowhere. That's investment credit creation. Let's see. So going down, we got Bretton Woods. That's become a huge issue for the world. But that could be covered. I might cover that in a later video. But that's become a huge issue for the world. Really, that had no effect for the U.S. Just a 1% contraction. So they assume. So in 1945, you see an 11.6% contraction, and they assume it's because World War II ended. But that's not the case, because in 1945 Truman was elected, and FDR died, and Truman did not know how investment credit creation worked. Hence, why we see such a massive contraction in GDP growth. So moving on through many years, contraction after contraction. Cold War begins 1947. I'm got 4.1%. So they think as the Cold War began, the US sees 4% increase in GDP growth. So GDP. So the US is nowadays is dependent on war, not for growth, but for resource related just control. So that's a different topic altogether. But back then, so you can make the argument now that, so the argument now is that war drives the U.S. economy. That's technically valid now, but it was different back then. It's not war that drove the U.S. economy back then. The U.S. economy was retrofitted for the war. So that's different from back then. I just wanted to clear that confusion up. 1948, see a contraction again. So this is the Truman years, and this like investment credit creation ceased being used. Some of FDR's other New Deal programs were still there at the time. So we'll fast forward to so now you see like growth rates more typical of what you see nowadays in the US. But we go down to 1980. So this is when Reagan was elected, and Reagan So 2.5% growth when Reagan was elected. His tax cuts result in a contraction of almost 2%, almost taking out the gains in the previous year. Presumably, the tax cuts, because of the tax cuts, the recession ended, and we see a 4.6% growth. We see a 7.2% growth in 1983 tax hike and defense spending. So that's why they think. So they think the reason this greater growth is because of a tax hike and defense spending. Tax hike for the poor and middle class, more like, not for the rich though. That wealth is being funneled up to the rich at this point. It's that process begins from the moment Reagan was elected. There were already forces in the background at play there. So let's go. We see growth progressively getting worse and worse here, getting lower, some outliers here and there. So another tax cut here. So they think that helps. It doesn't. It just cuts off your revenue. And when when it cuts off your revenue, you have a it's called you have a shit. I forgot. I'll get back to that. Fed raised rates, so interest rates. In neoliberalism, the belief is that interest rates have an effect on growth, when in reality they don't. They actually follow growth. So this just has nothing to do with it. Assault crisis, Black Monday, NAFTA drafted, balanced budget account, welfare reform. So by reform, I think they mean they completely got rid of it. Tech bubble burst, 2000, yeah, that 9/11. Believe it or not, 9/11 doesn't have much of an effect on GDP growth. It does maybe upset investor confidence, but that's like foreign direct investment. So in one of my Reddit posts, I did talk about that. Apologies, I can't articulate it as well as I can write it down, but basically FDI, short form for foreign direct investment, is very limited in scale, and it's highly dependent on how confident investors are in a given economy, and you just can't rely on that. For a government, you just can't rely on that kind of investment for your country. It's just too limited in scale. So it should be government-funded development primarily, and FDI is there just to help a little bit. Should be allowed. It's just there to help. 2001, 1.7%. Iraq War, yeah, and so on and so forth. And we see really slow growth rates here. Just, yeah, absolutely terrible. But their belief is that tax cuts for the rich help the rich, give the rich more consuming power. Technically, that's true, but in practice, it doesn't really work because, well, the rich can technically consume more. There's only, given that there's so few in number, there's only so much they can consume. And the rich tend to avoid even further taxes. They tend to stash their wealth in offshore tax havens. So there you go. Unless you have a law that prevents that from happening, really the rich are not going to invest that back into the economy. So that's a really highly mistaken assumption there on their part. And a lot of people buy into it because of conservative propaganda, really. There's really no sense in allowing so few people such immense consumption power. Whereas it makes more sense to have your middle class and your poor to have greater consumption power because they make up a far larger number. Consumption is also highly important in an economy. I would say second only to investment. So you need investment to build up stuff. You need consumption to circulate currency within the economy. And that's just simplified, of course, but there's other things to it. That's a simplified look at it. But yeah, so the reason all of this has caused so much suffering at home and abroad, and it's because of lobbying. The rich lobby for this kind of power. They have a stranglehold on the economy, and they're not going to let go of that easily at all. And if a president comes to power who wants to deal with that, tough luck. He'll be dealt with pretty quickly. So it's a really, even if a president wants to sort out that issue, it's incredibly tough for them to do so within the framework of liberal democracy. So yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about in this video today. Just to look at US history. So yeah, I'll see you later. Peace out.